It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been doing a little bit of island hopping in the last few hours. I started in Manhattan, then I went to Long Island, and now I'm in Ireland. I do regard us as just very, very close neighbors in the North Atlantic, and I proved it this evening because I'm sure you all know the flight, but you have dinner, you close your eyes for a moment, and the next thing you are landing. And it's a testimony to how close we are in every way. All of the business community, certainly, and our inspiration ideas are constantly shared, and it's a tremendous pleasure and honor to be in this wonderful country. That's why I said yes. Of course, I would say yes to you, Tina, anytime, but also anytime that I have a chance to come to Dublin, I grab the opportunity. Tina already indicated that we're in an unusual moment in the world. And I think the moment that we're in is a kind of paradoxical moment. These 17 Sustainable Development Goals represent something very, very unusual. They represent a global agreement, which is almost unheard of in this world. But these goals represent an agreement of every member state of the United Nations on a way forward in global cooperation for the coming generation. And they were followed by an equally momentous agreement just a few weeks after September 25th, 2015, last year, when these 17 goals were adopted. And that is on December 12, of course, the world agreed unanimously, the same 193 countries, agreed on the Paris Climate Agreement. So within a few brief weeks, we had something that we very rarely see, and that is global agreement, a unanimous decision on how to move forward. It's important, before I review what we have actually agreed, to have a sense of why we achieved a global agreement on two very important dimensions. One, sustainable development, and the second on climate and energy. We agreed essentially because of a fundamental paradox of our time. On the one side, we agreed because there are wonderful things that can be accomplished in the world right now. Momentous possibilities that were undreamt of by earlier generations. If you look at SDG 1, the box in the top row on the left-hand side, number 1, it says no poverty. The world agreed, and pretty serious, pretty conservative people in the world who negotiated this document agreed that it is feasible to contemplate a world with no poverty remaining by the year 2030. These goals are time-bound and they're quantitative when you read the details. And the world agreed on something that is extraordinary, and that is that we can end extreme poverty in this generation. This is an example of the positive motivation that underpinned this unanimous agreement. But the world also agreed on Goal 16, which is summarized down here as peace and justice, and in its more complete rendition is peaceful and inclusive societies. And the world agreed on that goal not because it is really anywhere in sight right now, but because, in fact, wars are raging and civil strife and conflict are raging across a swath of nearly 10,000 kilometers now, from the Sahel of Africa into Central Asia. and there is an alarm of a world that seems to be spinning out of control. So I view these two unanimous decisions taken by the world to adopt sustainable development goals and to adopt the Paris Climate Agreement as reflecting the greatest oddity of modern times, and that is our almost unlimited capacity to achieve great things if we put our mind to it, and our bloody-mindedness and our ability to make incredible disaster if we absent-mindedly move in that direction. And I think for me, this was put in its existential reality most beautifully a half century ago in words that for me are a kind of guide and a frightening reality day to day. And it's when President Kennedy said in his inaugural address, "For man holds in his mortal hand the ability to end all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." And that is our reality. That on the one side, we can do wonderful things. We can think about universal access to health care, universal access to education, gender equality. And on the other side, we have wars raging. We have a growing threat of, once again, something we imagined was not going to be with us ever again in our times, of confrontation between superpowers, Russia and Europe and the United States facing off against each other, a kind of raging name-calling on both sides, and opposing forces in Syria these days, growing threats in the South China Sea, and a world that seems profoundly uncertain, unstable, and dangerous, despite the fact that we're richer than ever before, and despite the fact that, as Tina said a few minutes ago, we have the lowest rate of poverty that humanity has ever known, with the poverty rate as measured by the World Bank worldwide having declined from around 37%, according to the World Bank estimates, for 1990 to under 10% of the world population today. A downward sloping line that, if you complete the dots and you accelerate them just a bit, reaches zero by 2030, which is why the world took heart and said that SDG 1, ending extreme poverty, was in sight. So the world agreed on sustainable development and the Paris Climate Agreement as part of that concept, both out of hope and out of fear. And it's wonderful to see this nation's business leadership together celebrating responsibility, because basically what corporate social responsibility should mean, and what it does mean, is choosing hope and moving in a direction of decency and solving national problems and helping to solve international problems. Nothing more and nothing less than that. That as business leaders, meaning that you're at the core of this country's economy, and you are leaders internationally, because all of those companies named are international companies with important and wonderful international reputations as well, that you have a particular responsibility to help move in the direction of hope and to give reason that we can put the fears aside. I really like the concept that was agreed by the world last year, this concept of sustainable development. What does it mean? The way that the 193 nations defined it is quite straightforward. It is that the world has a triple bottom line that is familiar to all of us, that we aim for economic prosperity, but we do so in a way that is socially inclusive and that is environmentally sustainable. So economic, social, and environmental objectives to be taken in a holistic way. And the governments, rather surprisingly in some way, and very seriously, negotiated the meaning of that triple bottom line in a period of 3 years. And you should be very proud that the government of Ireland played a leading role in those negotiations. Your UN permanent representative, David Donohue, who is a dear friend, is a wonderful leader at the United Nations. And he, together with his colleague, the permanent representative of the government of Kenya, for 3 years wrangled the world to come to a specific set of agreements. They worked hard at it, which again, maybe is a little surprising, but they took the assignment very seriously. It's worth noting why the General Assembly got that assignment. And it wasn't good news that gave them the assignment. It was kind of a makeup exam. What happened was that 24 years ago, the world came together in Rio de Janeiro at what I'm sure many of you will recall as the Rio Earth Summit. And the Rio Earth Summit, truth be told, was the place where the idea of sustainable development was first enunciated. And at that Rio Earth Summit, 3 major treaties were agreed. One is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the governing framework on addressing the climate threat. The second is the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third that was adopted in Rio is the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, meaning the spread of desert and degraded lands, especially in dryland regions. 3 big treaties, a new concept for the world's sustainable development. Fast forward 20 years to 2012. The UN likes to hold anniversary meetings. So there was the Rio Plus 20 meeting in June 2012. The governments came together for what was one of the most unhappy anniversaries I've ever been at. Because on the eve of that anniversary, Nature magazine, one of the great scientific weekly journals of the world, gave a report card on the Rio Earth Summit and these 3 treaties. And the report card was 3 Fs. That all 3 of the treaties had utterly failed to change the direction of the world. The climate agreement, you'll recall, was moved forward, we thought, in something called the Kyoto Protocol, which now will be nothing more than a footnote of history of failure, because that was an attempt to implement, starting in 1997, what had been agreed in 1992, and the US walked away from it 4 years later, and essentially it died a sad death, and the trajectory of the greenhouse gas emissions, and especially the carbon dioxide that is warming the planet, continued actually to accelerate. It didn't even continue at the same pace. It accelerated because of the growth of China. And this week, actually, Nature magazine ran a story, key story, that we have now definitively broken through another very risky barrier on the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's now 400 parts per million compared to the 280 parts per million at the beginning of the industrial era. And we're on a trajectory of profound danger. The Biodiversity Convention was not even ratified by the United States because our crazy Congress, and that is the only term that can apply, decided that protecting species was a violation of private property rights, and that any large landowner should have the right to destroy any species on their land if they want to. And I kid you not. So we didn't even ratify the treaty in the United States, and you've probably never heard of it again. And we are in what the ecologists have called the sixth great Earth extinction, meaning that we are now at threat of destroying the habitats or the climatic environment or the safety of millions of species on the planet. Some that we will never know because they will disappear before they're recognized and named, and many that we do know and we watch going out of existence. And when I was at the meeting of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature meeting in Hawaii a month ago, I picked up in a bookstore a big, beautiful book of gorgeous birds of Hawaii, but it was a book of all of the birds that have gone extinct in Hawaii. It was really so distressing, actually, to see how beautiful and how vanished forever and how thoughtlessly vanished forever. And, of course, the third treaty to combat desertification, I doubt that anyone here has even heard of it. And certainly in the United States, nobody knows it even exists. And why should they know? Whatever happens in dryland regions of the world. I mean, think of the drylands of the world, places like Mali or Sudan or Somalia or Iraq or Syria. We never have any problems there. We shouldn't pay attention to land degradation, hunger, diminishing water supply, so we never even gave a moment's notice to that treaty. Well, all of this is to say that we tried to put in place sustainable development a generation ago, and it failed. And in June 2012, therefore, the government said, we need to do something different. And the government of Colombia landed on a very good idea. I hope it's a good idea. It remains to be proved. It's what we are speaking about just now. They had the idea that we need not more legal treaties per se, but we need public understanding. We need clarity of what needs to happen. We need your children and my children and grandchildren to know what's happening in the world, what could happen on the good side, but what is the danger for the world, so that we can, through our awareness and our attention finally, and with our marvelous technologies and world-spanning businesses and management systems, finally address these challenges. Well, Ambassador Donohue and Ambassador Macharia had a task, because out of that Rio +20 meeting came an assignment: come up with sustainable development goals. And the first draft list had 300 proposals. So basically it was an effort, get them down from 300. And I made the proposal to use the Moses precedent, let's have 10. I thought 2 tablets would be fine, but finally when Ambassador Donohue came down from Sinai, they carried 3.5 tablets, 17 goals, and it's a little bit of a challenge to memorize them, but I do recommend, as CEOs of your companies, set a good example. Tomorrow when you call the managers in, ask them what SDG 9 is. When they say, I don't know, you say, you don't know that SDG 9 is innovation and infrastructure? By the next day, you will. And if we can spread the word and spread the attention, we can really make something of this. Now, if you look at them, they do incorporate the 3 pillars of sustainable development. There are a group of economic goals: ending poverty, ending hunger, very closely related, of course. SDG 3 is universal health coverage. Someday that will come to the United States. SDG 4, quality education for all children in the world. Meaning, specifically, when you look at the underlying quantification, that every child should at least achieve a high school education and be able to learn skills, vocational skills or higher education, to enable that young person to be a productive member of the world economy. You know it, and I know it, and everybody needs to know it, that there is no way out of poverty for anybody in this world, in any country, without an education now. And so SDG 4 is very clear on this and very appropriate, but in much of Africa today, only 20% of kids complete a high school degree. And think of what that means for the tens of millions who don't, what kinds of lives, jobs, livelihoods, stability, role in the world economy they will have unless this situation is rectified. Goals 6, 7, 8, 9 are more economic goals on ensuring access to clean water, to renewable energy, SDG 7, decent jobs and the end of child labor and the end of forced labor. And thanks to a strong voice of Pope Francis, a very clear statement to end all forms of bonded labor and modern slavery, which is part of SDG 8. And SDG 9 is for a modern 21st century infrastructure for all countries. Then there are the social inclusion objectives. We've heard about gender equality. And SDG 10 is quite remarkable. It's a commitment by all countries to narrow the inequality of income, which in the United States has soared during the last 30 years. The Gini coefficient, which you know measures inequality, has gone in the United States from around 0.3, which is moderate inequality, back in 1970 to around 0.45, depending on exactly which measure one uses, which is very high inequality. And if you want to understand Donald Trump's support, look to that unhappiness of a society that has allowed inequality to widen tremendously and to leave tens of millions behind, and very unhappy people who feel left behind. And also in social inclusion is SDG 16, which I've noted is calling for peaceful and inclusive societies, with indicators to reduce homicide rates, which are, as you know, extraordinarily high in my country and very high throughout the Americas, reflecting in part the vast inequalities in those societies, and looking for ways to end conflicts that are, of course, abounding in the world. The remaining SDGs, especially 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, are the environmental imperatives that we face. SDG 13 probably needs highlighting together with 14 and 15 as the most urgent of all. SDG 13 is to stop human-induced climate change. You live on an island economy, so do I. What the climate scientists tell us is that on the trajectory that we are heading, sea level will rise not by inches or centimeters, but by several meters. Because as my colleague and our great climate scientist in the United States, James Hansen, has shown in his recent research, the last time Earth was 1 degree C warmer than now, even less than 1 degree C warmer than now. The last time that prevailed, which incidentally was 130,000 years ago, the sea level was 6 meters higher than today, because just that small amount of extra warming is enough to set in train processes to undermine large parts of the West Antarctic ice sheet and Greenland. And that means several meters of sea level rise. That really annoys me, because I will not be able to get out of my apartment other than through a boat through the window. And Manhattan will be underwater. And we will regret that we were so casual with global society. But I can also tell you, ladies and gentlemen, because I am traveling relentlessly, and the one thing you learn as a UN official is there are a lot of countries in the UN, and they're all facing problems. Every place I go is in the midst of environmental stress. And sometimes it's shocking, a kind that you don't even realize, or that I don't realize. A few weeks ago, I was in Tehran and looked out the window, and it was completely gray in the middle of the day, and it looked like a Beijing afternoon to me, which is a smog-filled, deathly pollution of the air. And then I was told that's not pollution, that's not chemical haze, that's sand. I'd never seen a sandstorm that way. But because of the drying of the surface throughout the Middle East, there's a massive amount of dust and sandstorms now that are basically destroying the land, the crops, and of course are extraordinarily dangerous to breathe. And I went from there to Jakarta, literally as the next step, and there it was the same haze, but it wasn't the coal burning and it wasn't the dust storms, it was the peat burning from Sumatra because of the massive forest fires in what has been the hottest and one of the driest years in history for Indonesia this past year. And of course, Singapore had to close its schools for a week because it wasn't even safe to send the kids outside. So these goals are not to be taken lightly, these environmental goals. They are, even though it's hard for us, I think psychologically hard for us, look at how comfortable we are. Look at how rich we are. Look at how we enjoy our lives. We cannot feel the earth moving beneath us in that we're undermining fundamentally all that makes this possible. But when you go to more vulnerable parts of the world, you feel it directly. You understand why mega drought was one of the sources of the tinder that set off the Syrian war. You understand why the tensions are so high throughout the Middle East. You understand why crises of water, food, forest fires command the attention of governments and distract them from what we would regard as absolutely essential needs of focusing on the schools or other priorities that have to be put aside because of these emergencies. Let me say a few words, if I may, about what Ireland could do and should do in this story and in this challenge. I think that there are 4 areas that I would like to touch on. Of course, every one of these goals is every country's responsibility, and I would add every city's responsibility. In fact, yesterday in the afternoon, I had a meeting. I co-chair the Sustainability Board for New York City, and I'm happy to say that New York City has a Sustainable Development Goal plan for the city called 1NYC. And it takes the goals seriously, puts metrics, and is aiming for various achievements. And what we talked about for New York City yesterday, I have first on my list for Ireland today, and that is climate and energy policy. Because we need every high-income country that has grown up as a fossil fuel-based economy to make serious plans and investments to decarbonize the energy system within the next 40 years. But to do that, because of the length of our infrastructure, means acting now. Ireland has a plan, but it's not really a plan yet. It's some principles and some objectives, but it's not really a strategy, as far as I can see. Ireland needs a clear strategy, as does New York City, as does the United States. Every place in the world needs to take this seriously. And I would say all of us islands need to get together, because we're going to be goners if we don't. Now, what does it mean for Ireland? It means mobilizing the renewable energy in this country, analyzing options. For New York City, as I described it yesterday, it means an all-electric city where the electricity is produced in a zero-carbon way. That's the basic idea, that vehicles will be electric vehicles in the future. Get ready for that. That heating will not be in boilers and furnaces, but will be electric heating. That industrial processes will run on hydrogen fuel cells or reduction processes using electricity rather than open furnaces, and that the power generation needs to be clean. What are Ireland's options for this? What kind of renewable energy can you tap? How much wind potential is there onshore and offshore? How much hydro potential? Are biofuels really an answer? I have my doubts, but they are part of your scenario. What should be done on a European-wide basis? What are the strategies? The answers are not in place right now. And this is true everywhere, because no one has had to think about this problem ever before in a serious way. And so almost no country has a serious plan yet. There are a few. Always we can look to Scandinavia. They come first. Because Sweden, I assure you, has a plan. Norway, Denmark, they have plans. For the rest of us mere mortals, we're behind. And we need to move quickly. And I really call on Ireland, because of your own need and because of your role within Europe, to get this seriously underway. Europe has objectives, but objectives are not plans. They're different. Objectives are just nice things to do, but plans are how you're going to do them. And Europe doesn't have that. One reason, by the way, that Europe doesn't have it is that every country is considering it on its own, which is absurd, because the purpose of Europe should be work together. I know that sounds a little bit quaint these days, but I think it's extraordinarily important. Second, of course, is a challenge that's not new, and Ireland does it just about as well as any place in the world, and that is excellence in education and in innovation. This country is on a path to being truly one of the powerhouses of innovation in the world. It is the right livelihood for a country like this with a strong education system, great universities, a very strong business community, and the awareness that from a business perspective and a sustainability perspective, innovation is absolutely central. The old technologies will not achieve sustainable development. There will be massive transformation in how healthcare is delivered and how education is delivered and how our road and transport system works and how the energy system works. There needs to be. Agriculture needs fundamental technological changes just to stay resilient in a climate change world. And so innovation will be crucial, and any country like Ireland that aspires to be at the top of the world league in prosperity and a world leader in ideas needs to be at the top of the league in innovation, and you can make it, obviously, and are achieving that. The third I want to point out is tax policy and financial policy. Obviously, one of the most sensitive issues for this country and one of the complicating issues for the world. Now, first on financial policy, I need to sing the praises of the governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, Philip Lane, because he was one of my best students. So I say thank you, Philip. You make your professor very, very proud, because I can remember the day he entered my class on monetary economics. So when he does well, you can thank his professor. If he doesn't do well, it just means he forgot his lessons, I can assure you. But he's a wonderful and very, very impressive person. But we need Ireland's role in this, reform of international taxation and international finance. This country's policies are not adequate for a global, coherent tax framework. And the controversies over the Apple fines and so forth are reflecting a level of incoherence at the international system level. I don't blame Ireland for its policies. I just say that they are not adequate for what we need, because we need to be able to collect corporate taxation. Without that, we cannot fund our government. We cannot achieve the kind of fairness in our societies, and we cannot achieve a stability and predictability in the business environment. And so I mention this without going into detail, but just to say that we need to resist the path that we're on of a race to the bottom in tax policy. Basically, corporate taxation is disappearing from the screen right now. We've lost more than 1% of GDP in the United States. We've given it up, by the way. It's not that we've lost it, because our system is so corrupt that we're basically letting all of this money go untaxed as policy decision. But we cannot continue this way and expect social and political stability to be maintained. And the fourth point that I want to put is Ireland's role in the world, because Ireland has a phenomenal role to play in helping to achieve sustainable development throughout the world. And we face two huge challenges in the greater world. The first and the most important is expressed in SDG 16, peaceful societies. Unbelievably, we are engaged in mindless war that we seem unable to stop. And the United States, I'm sorry to say, is a major agent of that mindlessness. The Syrian war was a war to overthrow a government, to overthrow the Assad regime. A very unpleasant character, but it is against international law to mobilize rebels to overthrow a foreign government. We should not be doing this. Similarly, as NATO overthrew Gaddafi and left a calamity in Libya, that was also against international law. And I would say that our ongoing confrontation with Russia is both extremely dangerous and extremely unwise. I was advisor to Mr. Gorbachev 25 years ago and to Mr. Yeltsin a quarter century ago, and I know back in 1991 and 1992, there was no case for pushing NATO eastward, eastward, eastward to the Russian border. But we decided to do so because we wanted to win rather than to solve problems after the end of the Cold War. And I think we stepped over tripwires that have made our situation extremely dangerous. And I can't help thinking that 100 years ago, we were in a mindless war that was so mindless that historians have never figured out why it really happened, why World War I occurred. And I think it's basically because that's what human beings do when they take their mind off of what's important. And that's why I put an enormous stress on Ireland playing a role to help push for peaceful resolution of these crises, not to feed the militarized vision of foreign policy. We will soon have President Hillary Clinton in office, and she needs absolutely to hear when she comes into office that we want peace in this world, not stepped up belligerence, not showing how tough she can be to Mr. Putin, not showing a no-fly zone in Syria, not overthrowing the Assad regime, but peace. Because without that, we don't stand a chance. And this, I think, is a place where Ireland has an important voice and can play an important role. And then on sustainable development, I would ask all of your companies not only to consider what you are doing within Ireland, but how your technologies, your business models, your product lines, your expertise can contribute to achieving the sustainable development goals in other parts of the world, and especially in the remaining hotspot of poverty in the world, sub-Saharan Africa. Africa is a major challenge for global development. It's the last place of high concentration of poverty in the world. The migration crisis that Europe experiences now will be nothing compared to what Europe experiences if Africa does not achieve a sustainable development course. You may be surprised to know that the forecast right now, it's not a forecast, it's a medium projection, medium fertility projection, it's called, of the UN Population Division, has Africa's population growing to 4 billion people by the end of this century, unless there are significant changes in education and fertility rates. And I would not wish this on Africa, and I would not wish this on Europe. And the most important single thing to do for Africa is to help achieve SDG 4. Education for all. Help Africa's girls and boys stay in school, get trained, get educated. Fertility rates will come down sharply. Africa's population will peak at 2 billion, not 4 billion. And the prospect for economic growth and development will be, by those measures, tremendously improved. Please think about how your companies can contribute. And there were many companies that received the wonderful award today. If you're an accountancy, you can contribute. Vodafone has been the great pioneer of mobile wallet in Africa, the M-Pesa system, which spurred a revolution of e-payments in countries that didn't have banks but now have electronic payments nationwide. Johnson & Johnson has crucial health products that can help to achieve SDG 3, health coverage for all. Think about what you can do. And remember, and it's been my experience, whenever I go out to a rural area, a distant, poor, health-burdened rural area, there are the Irish sisters that are doing their work. Please help them by having your companies find that mission, that partnership, that way that you can use your business model and your technology to help achieve these goals. Well, let me end just with one suggestion to all of you. One of the greatest embodiments of wisdom that I know is a speech that President Kennedy gave here in Ireland a half-century ago. If you haven't recently listened to his speech to the Irish Parliament in June 1963, get online and do it. And among the many wonders of that speech, he says a couple of things that I want to close with. One, he calls on Ireland to help promote peace. And he reminds all of us in the most wondrous words that peace is always possible. Because he says, and I'll quote, "Across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember that there are no permanent enemies. Hostility today is a fact, but it is not a ruling law. The supreme reality of our time is our indivisibility as children of God and our common vulnerability on this planet." And then he says, this is an extraordinary country. Ireland is an extraordinary country. And he quotes George Bernard Shaw, of course, in the famous expression of Shaw that some see things as they are and ask why, but I dream things that never were and ask why not. He says that's the Irish spirit, and he concludes the speech by saying, Ireland's hour has come. Thank you very much.